And we're at 6:29. We're going to get started in about a minute. See, we got some more coming in. Thank you for joining us. And we are live on Facebook. Thank you to anyone who is joining us on Facebook. We will be admitting Zoom attendees for the next minute or so, and then we're going to get started. And it looks like it's 6:30. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host tonight, Mary Jane Calderon. Alongside me here is our Mr. Curator of Collections, Jason French. Jason,
hello,
would you like to tell a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am the curator at Behringer-Crawford Museum, and I am going to be helping present here with Brian Hackett tonight, because I, of course, have had a few years in the museum business, about 26 or so, and I was a student of Dr. Hackett's, and it's just a pleasure to be a part of that, and I've got a little maybe experience to add to it as well.
Great. Okay, so let's see here. Let's see. Before we begin, let's thank all of those that make this amazing program possible. So Behringer-Crawford Museum is supported in part by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, ArtsWave, Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation, and our members. If you're not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining for access to discounts and exclusive programming. Learn more and join at bcmuseum.org. Okay, we got some more joining us. Let's go ahead and admit those. And let's go over a few reminders. Everyone's microphone has been muted so we can all focus on the presentation. Feel free to turn off your video if you prefer. Otherwise, others on the call are going to be able to see you even when the screen is being shared. If you have a question or a comment to share, please type it in the chat feature, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible immediately following the presentation. Also, there will be a quiz question tonight. So the first respondent to enter a correct answer in the chat on Zoom or Facebook Live will win a Northern Kentucky History Hour pin. Okay, let's go here. Sorry, I should have had the bio pulled up and I didn't. Let's go here. And okay, so let's see, Dr. Hackett. So we have Dr. Brian Hackett with us. He has extensive experience in the field of public history and has a special interest in museum exhibits. He was responsible for management and development of historic sites as executive director of the Montgomery County, Ohio Historical Society from 1992 to 2004. He also served as executive director of the Ross County, Ohio Historical Society from 1987 to 1992, and curator of collections for the Olmstead County, Minnesota Historical Society from 1985 to 87. His public history students have helped to create exhibits for several museums in Ohio and Kentucky, including Behringer-Crawford Museum. So welcome, Dr. Hackett. And you can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Terrific. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's such an honor to be working and talking once again with the Behringer-Crawford Museum, which of course is, and hopefully nobody from the outside is listening right now, but one of the best kept secrets in Northern Kentucky, if not the Cincinnati region. So without further ado, I'll get us started with the little slideshow here. So you don't have to look at my face the whole time, which is kind of nice. Okay, where'd it go? Hang on a minute. Okay, wait a second. Yeah, we need to be here.
There we go.
All right, there we go. As you'll notice, I put 64 years of experience because combined with Jason's 26 years, I have 38 years, which is incredible because I'm only 26. But museums have been really a part of my life for my entire career, since my middle college years when I started working in a museum. And so one of the things that we want to talk about with Jason and a few of you others who have been actually in the business for a while, I want to talk about a little bit about the history of museums, how museums have been set up, how they're managed, but then also talk about some of the challenges we face. We're going to dive into a little bit of controversy. We're going to dive into a little bit of fun, because museums, I think, are an incredible career path. I've never had the same day twice, to tell you the truth. And just when I think I've seen everything, something comes along. I've been asked to open time capsules. I've been asked to sit in ghost hunts. I have done exhibits. I've met presidents. I've done a lot of things that, quite frankly, I never thought I would in my career. So without further ado, we'll get diving into this thing. So I always tell my students that museums do three things. We collect, we preserve, we educate. And I think, you know, joke fully intended, that museums are one of the oldest professions that people have. And of course, it starts with cave drawings. Because if you think about it, if museums do, we collect things, we preserve things, and we educate with those things. We tell stories. And that's what cave dwellers did. They decorated their walls and they told stories. And you can imagine, you know, some rainy night in a cave in France, gathered around a fire while one caveman explains to the other cave people about one great hunt that took place 20 years ago. Our language is better. Hopefully our exhibits are better, but we're basically do the same thing. The art is interpretation. Would you agree with me, Jason?
I would. I would completely agree. The art is the interpretation and how you tell that story in an engaging way that inspires people to want to do that in the future.
Exactly. So going up from the time of the caveman, of course, jump into the time of the Egyptian pharaohs and the mummies. And part of the paintings and part of the things they discover inside of tombs are complex pictorial stories. And here's a good one. This is from a pharaoh's tomb in Egypt, and it depicts a battle between Egyptian troops and Ethiopian raiders. And you can see there's a lot going on here. You can see that there's a story to be told here. And you can imagine, even without a narrator telling you what you're seeing, there's a lot going on. And of course, it's a story of great triumph. I'm sure that it's been embellished quite a bit, but that's sort of the nature of how we tell history at times. So more modern museums come from, rather than being in tombs and in caves, they start out with rich men who like to show that they're smart. And they start out with what's called a cabinet of curiosities. And there is a great legacy of cabinet of curiosities in this area. Generally, men who like to show off that they're not only their wealth, but their wisdom, go around collecting things and then charging people to come and see them. The bigger cabinet you had, the more important you were. And some of the things that end up in cabinets, of course, are works of art, bones, fossils, taxidermied animals, all sorts of things. And these were to show that you were learned. This is what to show you and show your public that you were a man of wealth and significance. And of course, two of probably the grandest institutions in the world were started this way. The one on the left, of course, is the British Museum. It started as a large cabinet of curiosities for a very wealthy man who decided, upon his aging and not being able to take care of it anymore, that he would start the British Museum. On the other hand is the Smithsonian. I'm sure you've heard of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian was started by a gentleman by the name of Smithson. He was English. And he actually, when he died, he donated his cabinet to the United States to be the first American museum. And that's how the Smithsonian began. Jason, do you have anything to add?
Well, you know, before the Smithsonian, we had other museums in America. There were cabinets of museums, and in Cincinnati, the first group of people to say they were going to open up a museum was a group called the Western Museum Society, and they said that in June of 1818. They actually opened their doors in 1820, but before they could open their cabinet and library, there was this other guy named Ralph Linton in Cincinnati that opened up his museum in 1819. So it's an interesting, regionally, we've had museums that since that time, over 200 years.
I believe actually the first museum, quote unquote, museum in Ohio territory, or in Ohio, was in 1806. And it was a traveling show which included a lion. And from the descriptions I've read in newspapers, said the lion just sort of laid there. And that was the entire show. But speaking of local cabinets, there's a lot of local ties to a lot of very famous cabinets. One of them was the Peel Museum. This is the ad for Peel. This is the gentleman who owned it. His name was Charles Peel. And he's the gentleman on the right here. And I don't know how well you can see it, but if you move, if our pictures are all on the right, behind Mr. Peel in the picture on the right, you can just see the legs of a mastodon. This was his cabinet in his mansion. As you can see, he's lifting the veil to unveil it to everyone. The funny thing about that mastodon is it came from Big Bone Lick. Not only did his mastodon come from us, but also if you look over to the left, you'll see a crude drawing of Thomas Jefferson in front of a giant ground sloth. In Monticello, Jefferson kept a skeleton, fully erected skeleton of a ground sloth. And of course, that was a ground sloth where the bones and the fossils were found at Big Bone Lick as well. And in fact, the gentleman that found it and ended up giving it to Mr. Jefferson named it after Jefferson. As you can see on the lower left side of your screen, the name that was given to the giant ground sloth. Megalonyx jeffersoni was the Latin name for this ground sloth. Of course, both of these came from Big Bone Lick. So we were in the museum business before anybody else. So this is also something very interesting. And I'm kind of going to leave this over to Jason to tell you about, because this is the Western Museum, a flyer for the Western Museum.
And that flyer is for the Western Museum around 1828. Those original proprietors and that club of guys that started the Western Museum, they were not able to manage it where it was making any money. So they turned it over to another gentleman who was very learned, very engaging, but he still had to find ways, and it's always kind of an ongoing museum problem, is how do you bring in your clientele to gain revenue? Well, by 1828 or so, he had been working with a young American sculptor named Hiram Powers, and probably Francis Trollope and a French painter named Hervieux as well. And they had came up with a evening event, a diorama of Dante's Inferno, where they were using mechanized waxed figures that could talk to the crowd. It was almost a theater presentation. And that was a way that they were able to bring in money to actually advance the collection and to continue having the museum open. And it was very popular. People were paying 25 cents to get in a person, and they would come and see these evening events, these performances, and learn about Dante's Inferno and see these wax figures. Some of them would grow from the size of a dwarf to a giant. It was a very popular presentation. Not what we necessarily think of as museums for the modern era, though.
And very true. And you'll notice that two of the main characters here are Beelzebub and Lucifer. But there are actually museums today that will do similar things to bring in people. Hopefully they're a little bit more scholarly than the infernal regions, but I know Colonial Williamsburg celebrates Christmas, and there's no evidence that at Colonial Williamsburg they ever celebrated Christmas. In fact, America didn't celebrate Christmas much before 1840. So, you know, museums still try to do things to bring people in to make it interesting. Hopefully we're better at it than our ancestors were. But to tell you the truth, I would have loved to see what the infernal regions look like. Because of course, people want to know where you're going to end up, I guess. You also, there's something else on this poster that's interesting, and that's the mermaid. And you, Jason, don't you have a theory about where that mermaid ended up?
So the Western Museum existed really until 1867. And it's fascinating because the last real owner of the Western Museum was a woman named Mary English. And she ended up starting a museum also in Indianapolis around the time of the Civil War that was called at the time the Indiana State Museum. I don't know that the current Indiana State Museum has any ties to it. But in 1867, the museum had gone through a number of proprietors and ownership. It had declined in its scholarship for really by 67 for at least 20 or more years. It had had declining scholarship. They eventually auctioned off the collection. That mermaid, which was a major part of the museum in the 1820s, I've got a pretty strong theory that it ended up in Springfield, Ohio, in the museum in Springfield, because there is a Fiji mermaid in a cabinet of curiosities that's just a cabinet that was donated to that museum from the 1870s, where most of that collection is from. But in the bottom of that cabinet is a Fiji mermaid in an old display case that is much older than the rest of that 1870s cabinet. And if the collection from the Western Museum was, say, auctioned in 1867, it would be natural for someone right after that to acquire that and then start their own cabinet in, say, the 1870s.
Also would like to note that 25 cents in 1828 was pretty much a week's salary.
Yeah, not cheap at all.
Not cheap at all. Playing upon this, when I was director of the museum in Dayton, Ohio, I had been sitting around with some of my colleagues, and we talked about the strange things that end up in museums, whether they're holdovers from the Cabinet of Curiosity days or just things that end up in museums. So we put our heads together and we worked with the Museum of Natural History in Dayton, and we created an exhibit, and we called the exhibit Curious Collections. And we borrowed museum items from all over this area and put up an exhibit of the strange things that end up in museums, just regionally around the city of Dayton and between Dayton and Cincinnati. So these are some of the things that we had. You're probably wondering about the 3 skulls that you see over to the left. We actually had 3 skulls of the same guy, which we had a lot of fun with. It's kind of morbid, but there had been, the museum the museum I worked at, the Ross County Historical Society, at the museum I had worked on previously was the Ross County Historical Society, had this in their collection. And supposedly these skulls all belonged to one man. There had been a famous hermit who lived along between Piketon and Chillicothe, and he lived in a cave, and he would make a living helping people get their wagons over the hills between Piketon and Chillicothe. Well, one time he didn't feel well and he was sick, and he went into town to visit a doctor. And unfortunately, while visiting the doctor, he passed away. And since he didn't have any relatives, the doctor took the man's body and converted it into a skeleton to be used for anatomical study. And this doctor had this skeleton in his office for as long as he practiced. And he passed it on to his son, who was a doctor, and so on. Well, in 1923, someone showed up at the museum and said, I have the head of William Hewitt, the famous hermit of the Scioto Valley. And so he gave it to the museum with the whole story about him being turned into an anatomical study skeleton and so on. In 1948, someone showed up and said, I have the head of William Hewitt, the famous hermit of the Scioto Valley. And it was passed on through my family, who was from a doctor. Lo and behold, 1965, someone shows up. I have the head of William Hewitt. So the museum has 3 separate skulls, all labeled with the same man's name. So they used it in their exhibits, and we used it for this exhibit. You'll see we have a ghost photograph that was in the collection. We have a shipwreck of the battleship Maine, because we collect, every museum in the area had pieces of the battleship Maine. So we had collected, we thought we had enough pieces of the Maine to build a battleship. Up in your upper right-hand corner, it shows some lava. Unfortunately, I didn't have a picture of the artifact, but we had a lump of lava in the shape of the Pope. Unlike the Behringer-Crawford Museum that has a 2-headed sheep or 2-headed calf, we had a sheep with 2 butts. That's their picture. We had one of the first flush toilets ever invented in the collection. We had the gallows that they used to hang people on the square with in downtown Dayton. There's a rocking chair there supposedly that belonged to Abraham Lincoln. We had 6 chairs that supposedly belonged to Abraham Lincoln from different museums in Ohio. We had we had damage from the Shenandoah, which was a dirigible that crashed in southern Ohio. And we also had a bird's nest that was made out of metal shavings that was found in a machine shop in Dayton and was given to the Museum of Natural History. So these are the weird things that can end up in museums. And I bet if you ask anybody that has worked in a museum, present company included, Jason, there's always a bit of the weird. Some museums are embarrassed by it. Sometimes curators just sort of chuckle amongst themselves. And during the pandemic, a bunch of European museums got together and they were posting their pictures of the weirdest things they had in their collections. And they really outdid themselves. They had death masks, and they had plague masks, and they had all sorts of torture devices and things like that were just too bizarre to believe. Jason, do you have anything like that?
I don't have a plague mask or a death mask, but one of the things that jumps out, and I've got a silver painted tree that's been made of chicken wishbones, and the wishbones were the folk artist that made it wrote celebrities at the time and just asked them to send wishbones from the chickens that they had eaten. So there's supposedly Shirley Temple sent him a wishbone. It's on that tree. It's just a very weird thing, this tree that's made of wishbones. We've got other things like bits of Peruvian fabric from 2,000 years ago, and a little jar with lampreys in it that's natural history specimen. Why would we have that? Juvenile lampreys, or we've got our 2-headed calf, or the little English toy terrier that's taxidermied. We've got a little bit of everything, including, of course, our shrunken head.
Like I said, museums have these all the time. And it harkens back to our Cabinet of Curiosity days, and the fact that people will give things to museums because they don't know what else to do with it. And quite frankly, a lot of us are glad to have them. So things to remember when we're talking about more modern museums is that museums are first and foremost educational institutions. I know that sounds kind of dry, but really that's why we're created, to keep the past alive and to help teach people the lessons from the past. We're a keeper of community memories, and we have a responsibility to reflect the whole community. And that's important because museums in the past quite often focused on things like rich people, their houses, the events of famous people and politicians. And quite often that's great, but unfortunately, it doesn't give people a lot to relate to. So it's important that an institution's mission recognize the responsibility of keeping the history of the whole community and not just part of it, based on, of course, its mission statement. We are collecting institutions for the most part. We have to have something that we use to tell our stories with. And this is important to remember, that it's easy to illustrate a story if you have the items to illustrate with. And remember that sometimes history is a good story, well told, and sometimes it's not a very good story, but it is the truth, and that's important. Also tell people when they feel sad about events that took place in their communities, that you're no more responsible for what your ancestors did than they're responsible for what you're doing. You have no control of who your ancestors were and what they did. Also, one of my favorite games I like to play with my students is that the idea is there's no such thing as the good old days. The good old days for me is when I'm about 11 or 12 years old. I'm playing outside in the summer, there's no school, with my friends, and we're playing kick the can, and my mom yells out that she just bought pizza for us all. Those are the good old days. But if you look at it, it's a wonderful time to be alive now with modern healthcare, and modern technology. Our ancestors didn't have it so good. In fact, some of us who are in our late 50s or early 60s can remember some times that weren't as good as now. So I like to tell people that the good old days weren't always good, and the today isn't always bad. So anyway, moving right along, I'll get off my soapbox. Museums have to have a purpose, and the purpose, of course, starts with the mission statement. So I've got a couple of mission statements up here for you. Some of them are easily recognizable. One of my favorite is the first one, and it's the universe and everything in it. That's the mission statement for an institution that you're all very familiar with. That's the National Geographic Society, the universe and everything in it. The second one, I'm not going to tell you who that's for. And this is the trivia question for today. Who can find out whose mission statement is the increase and diffusion of knowledge? That's the mission statement for this organization, this museum. Okay, next one is from the Holocaust Center. The United States Holocaust Museum is America's national institution for the documentation, study, and interpretation of Holocaust history, and also this country's memorial to the millions of people murdered during the Holocaust. The next one is with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And of course, you probably could guess that right away, that says that to engage, teach, inspire through the power of rock and roll. And then, of course, the last one you might recognize as well, or you should recognize. And that, of course, is with the Behringer-Crawford Museum. So start thinking about number 2 there and see who can come up with our answer. Excuse me. So museums have to, as collecting institutions, we have to think a lot about what we take and what we don't take. And I know that this is something that Jason has to deal with on a regular basis. And when I was working in a museum, you'd be surprised. In fact, I'll show you some of the things that I was offered as a museum director. Things to remember. One is there's liability with every piece of your collection. So if you have items in your collection and you're on the board of directors and those items gets damaged or lost, you have a potential of having liability for that, according to the law. So you got to think about what you're taking care of and whether you can take care of it. And that's really important, where a lot of museums fall into, where they take things that they think are wonderful but can't take care of. Collections care is expensive, and it's very hard to fund, to tell you the truth, because you'll notice if you go to the Cincinnati Museum Center, if you go to the Taft Museum of Art, you go into galleries, and quite often the galleries have names on them, and they're names that people who donated money. You go into the collection storage room, it doesn't have anybody's name on it. It's not glamorous or exciting to put your name in a storeroom or in a box of, or a bunch of racks. So those are fairly hard to fund. Also, you have to think about relevance to your mission. I can't tell you how many times I was offered something that I really wanted, but it didn't fit the description of the museum. So if you think about like someplace like the Behringer-Crawford Museum, what makes the museum unique? There are a lot of museums that you could take out of Cincinnati and stick in Indianapolis and nobody would care. It wouldn't make any bit of difference. And the difference that a place like the Behringer-Crawford makes is that it's audience. How does the audience make the museum different? You know, what is unique about this place? And I'm sure you could come up with a dozen different ideas, but uniqueness is important because we're telling the story of a certain place, not a general place. So one of the museum has to think about is, how does it reach its audience? How does it help create a community's identity? And of course, that's through its collections. There are wonderful things as you go through the Behringer-Crawford Museum, as well as many other museums in this area. You see a lot of things that are unique to this place. We did an exhibit with students at the Behringer-Crawford Museum, and we were talking a lot about immigration and the things that make Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati unique. It's funny when I talk to students who have spent their whole lives in this area and they get a job someplace like Indianapolis or Chicago or whatever, and they're surprised that they can't get geta. In fact, they're at a restaurant, they're having breakfast, they order geta, and people look at them and go, "What are you talking about?" The same thing with Cincinnati chili. I grew up in Milwaukee, or a suburb of Milwaukee, and bratwursts in Milwaukee do not taste like bratwursts in Cincinnati. And that's because the Germans who settled the Cincinnati area and Northern Kentucky area are not the same Germans that settled Milwaukee. A whole different palate when it comes to seasoning bratwursts. So it's very interesting how these stories can make us unique. So I want to show you some of the things that that questions when it comes to getting items. Is it relevant? I was once offered a sailboat for my museum. We were in the middle of downtown Dayton, Ohio, in an old courthouse. Didn't have any space for a sailboat. And I couldn't convince my board of directors that that would be a good perk for the director of the museum to have. Can you take care of it? I know a museum that was offered a locomotive. Locomotive is expensive to take care of, not let alone store and interpret. Are the things that you want to collect, are they fleeting? One of the challenges I give my students is, some of you remember McDonald's. McDonald's used to serve its Big Mac in a styrofoam case. There were literally billions and billions and billions of those created. I challenge you to find one. You're not going to be able to find one because they're gone, but they reflect a lot about our community, don't they? So most curators, I'm assuming, and I don't want to speak for Jason, is you think about, does this truly reflect our community? Does this really reflect who we are? And there are other questions you need to ask. I mean, I'm sure, Jason, you've got questions you think of when people offer you things all the time.
Yes, yeah. Well, you're always kind of, it's hard sometimes because somebody will walk in or they'll call you or contact you and you'll develop a rapport with them, and man, you like the person, and you like maybe even the artifact, but then you're in your mind, you're going, okay, is this something that I'm ever going to be able to display? How am I going to talk about it? How is it going to advance our mission, our story? Do I have room for it? How am I going to preserve it, take care of it? Even if I'm not going to display it now, am I going to, is the next curator or the next curator after me, them, going to be able to display it? Or is it going to lose all of its relevance, hidden in a collection, taking space that I could better use for something that we can tell a story a little easier for? And I'm always getting wonderful items, really neat things offered to us that we just can't take. You were offered a sailboat once. I believe in the last year and a half, we were offered a ferry boat from Henderson Ferry. So we couldn't get it. There was no way, where were we going to put it? It was a ferry boat.
Here, I put up some examples of things that I was offered as a curator, as a museum director over the years that I've worked. I remember, in particularly, there's a picture of some teacups here. I remember when I was working with the Behringer-Crawford Museum, an exhibit on St. Elizabeth Hospital. And we were at a meeting over at what used to be St. Luke's. And we were coming out, and this woman stopped the curator and said, "Oh, I'm glad I ran into you. My aunt just died, and she has a collection of 500 teacups, and we like to donate them to the museum." And of course, the curator said, "That sounds like a wonderful gift, but unfortunately, it doesn't fit our mission." You can imagine those conversations. Somebody's aunt died, a beloved aunt who is a collector, and they don't want to break up the collection. So what do you do when nobody wants the collection? You turn it over to the museum. Well, what is Behringer-Crawford going to do with 500 teacups? It takes a lot to display them. It takes a lot to store them, and they don't fit the mission of the institution. So maybe there's another institution where it does fit, but not the Behringer-Crawford Museum. To the right of that picture is a picture of a pianoforte, which is a mid-19th century piano with lead strings. I've been offered 4 of those. And when you have a house museum, how many pianos can you use? I was even offered one that had no legs. So as much as I would like to preserve and keep an artifact, I can't use something that's not complete when I have other artifacts. So we ended up having one and telling the other 3 that thank you, but no thank you. We were offered a house, which got me very excited until I found out that it was offered to me because it had been so badly damaged by termites that it had been condemned and had to be torn down. And the people who wanted to donate it to us just didn't want to have the expense of tearing it down. So they offered it to us so that we would do it for them. I've been offered human remains, which of course is not only not good for the museum, it's illegal. And in fact, Native American remains had to be removed out of museums a long time ago. And some people had them in their personal collections. I have a friend who used to run the Mound City group, the Indian Mounds in Chillicothe. And he said they'd come to work and they'd find bags of human remains on their front steps on a regular basis because people didn't know what to do with them. Another picture I have here is a woman with a taxidermied horse. We were located in the old courthouse in downtown Dayton. I have no use or no space for a taxidermied horse. There is a museum in Rock Island, Illinois, run by a friend of mine, and he had 6 taxidermied horses in his collection, which is remarkable. You think it's remarkable, but he used to have 12 and was able to get rid of half of them. Taxidermied animals are really a bad idea, especially ones that were were taxidermied in the 19th and early 20th century, because they were usually taxidermied with arsenic, which can prove very deadly. I put this ordnance sign in because one day a gentleman walked into my museum with a crate full of unexploded ordnance that he had collected at the artillery range at Camp Sherman, which was a World War I training base outside of Chillicothe. And his family had collected these over the years, and he wanted to donate them to the museum. I called the bomb squad. The bomb squad said that they were all still very dangerous, and they took them all away. I had a friend that worked at a museum in Michigan, who in their World War II display, he was actually interviewing for a curator's position. They were giving him a tour of the museum, and in the back of the World War II display, they had hand grenades hanging up by their pins in the back of the display case. So he asked them if those were live grenades, and they said, we don't know.
Oh, no.
So they called the bomb squad, and of the 12 grenades that were hanging them there, 8 of them were live. So, obviously the bomb squad took them all away and detonated them safely, but that's something that you really don't want at your museum. Okay, last but not least, over here in the left-hand corner is a picture of the Serpent Mound. I had a gentleman come to my museum. This was again in Chillicothe, and he wanted to give me his research on the Serpent Mound, and which sounds on the surface pretty good, but what his argument was, and he had all this paperwork to back it up, was the Serpent Mound was actually a representation of a comet, a celestial comet, which is fine, and it may be, I don't know. But then he said, based on his research and his conclusion, all religion is false. So he brought this material in and wanting me to build an exhibit based on his research that would prove that all religion, include, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, was false, because the Serpent Mound was a comet. Needless to say, I told him that he needed a few more steps between the Serpent Mound being a comet and religion all false. So I politely declined. So this is kind of the weird stuff that you can get into in the museum business. Like I said, you never have the same day twice. It's important to remember that museums are learning institutions. They're set up, there's certain guidelines and certain laws that have to be followed, but that doesn't mean you can't have a good time in educating and keeping people engaged. So one of the things that we've gotten into lately, and I'll cover this rather quickly, includes the debate over Confederate monuments. And of course, one of the things that we run into is the conflict between history and myth. I don't know if any of you know about the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, starring John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. At the end of the movie, after Jimmy Stewart tells the whole story of this gun battle with Liberty Valance, this bad guy throughout the whole movie, and he tells him that he didn't actually shoot Liberty Valance, it was John Wayne. The old newspaper reporter grabbed the young reporter's notebook and tore it up. And he turns to the young reporter and he says, "This is the West, sir. When the truth conflicts with the myth, print the myth." And of course, the myth surrounding the Civil War is incredible. It's kind of, it kind of boggles the mind sometimes. And I'll give you an example of that. You think about Confederate monuments. There's actually in the city in Ohio, there are 5 Confederate monuments dedicated to Confederate soldiers, and there's one actually in Franklin, Ohio, dedicated to Robert E. Lee. Okay. And the strange thing that strikes me as being weird about that is that Robert E. Lee, of course, led the Confederacy and was responsible, because of the Civil War, led to the deaths of 26,000 Ohioans. It just seems very strange to me that we would erect a monument to a man who killed Ohioans, who made war on American soldiers. But so the question is, why? I once had a conversation with a woman in up in north of Cincinnati who wanted to lead a campaign to build a monument to John Hunt Morgan and Morgan's raiders who had come through the town, and they had actually lynched the sheriff of the town, stole a lot of property from people, and beat up a lot of people. But yet she wanted to build a monument to this person who had come through. That's the power of the myth that we've created around the Civil War, that somehow some of these people who did terrible things are worthy of praise. And now a lot of historians will debate this, but as a historian and as a museum, we're responsible to reflect the truth of what happened, not what was created or what we think happened. Anything you want to add to that, Jason, or you want to just avoid that one altogether?
Well, no, it's absolutely so much of, in particular, these monuments, they were erected 40, 50, 60, 70 years after the fact. It's kind of this idealized, that a lot of the truth of it was already kind of forgotten, and people have this kind of myth in their mind, and it's interesting how we deal with myth, how that we tell that, and there's a lot of like politics and other things that go into it that's really interesting from a historian perspective and a history perspective. And now we're dealing with this again, as we realize as a society, hey, why is this here? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we understand that. Now there's other things that occasionally happen. I remember in Ohio several years ago, there was a statue of poor Colonel Crawford, who had been on the wrong end of a conflict with some Native Americans. His statue was defaced or beheaded, and that I kind of felt was bad. But some of these Confederate monuments were, why are they there? So I agree with that. It's one of those things, as historians, as museum people, we need to be able to have these conversations, and find ways to engage people so that they have the tools to understand both sides of those stories.
Sorry to interrupt, but Mark Koenig had a question that might relate with this. He wanted to know what your position is on the current wave of forcing the removal of statues, memorials of people now deemed evil or unpopular. So I didn't know if you wanted to answer that now, or if you wanted to.
Yeah, I can answer that if you'd like. There's the problem is the statues have been taken out of context. And a lot of times they were erected as sort of giving the middle finger to the civil rights movement and to the people in the North. In the 1870 governor's election in Ohio, one of the campaign platforms for the winner was not to honor the South. The South wanted its battle flags that had been captured in the war returned. And there were slogans, and I remember one in particular was that, don't return the battle flags, of our traitorous enemy. And that was the general feeling, is that the South was responsible for the many deaths that came out of the Civil War. And there was an actual hatred of those people. But in the time between, probably 1880 and 1920, there was this resurgence of what they call the lost cause, which is a complete fabrication, that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, that it had nothing to do, that these were men fighting for their rights. Yeah, the rights to own other people. And so I think that they should be taken out of places of honor, but they should be put in a park or someplace where they can be interpreted correctly, and that both sides should be seen. If you look at it from a perspective of both Union Civil War veterans or the families of Civil War veterans, or the families of people who died fighting for the Union as American soldiers. And also, not to mention the African Americans who are descended from enslaved people. These people are not heroes. They're bad guys. And to tell you the truth, if you sit down and think about it, if we're reflective of America, we can't honor one group over another, thinking that, oh, if I put up a statue of Robert E. Lee here in Franklin, and what he stands for, it's not a good thing. There's no way you can spin it that way. Because of the Civil War, 26,000 Ohioans died. Think of all the orphans, and think of all the families that never were because of that. So to tell you the truth, I think that you should take these monuments and put them in a park or put them near a museum where they can be properly interpreted and the people can be put into context. When I was in grad school working on my PhD in Tennessee, I learned a lot about Nathan Bedford Forrest. There are more monuments dedicated to Nathan Bedford Forrest than any other Civil War soldier in the state of Tennessee. And in fact, there are a whole week of celebrations called Nathan Bedford Forrest Days. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a founder of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay. He was responsible for, he supposedly killed 31 men in open combat and lost 32 horses. So he was a horse ahead, he always said. They don't tell you that some of the men that he killed were his own men because he didn't like it that they failed in their orders, so he would shoot them. Before the war, the people of the South hated him. He was the lowest form of life because he was a slave dealer. And that's why when he joined the Confederacy, he had to start his own regiment because nobody liked him. But suddenly now he's a hero? That doesn't make any sense to me. And it's all because of the changed perspective that people had developed in what they create as a lost cause. So to shorten my answer a little bit, I'm sorry, I went too long, is that yes, I think those monuments should be taken down, but I think that they should not be destroyed. I think they should be put someplace and put in context. Okay. And sort of to illustrate that point, we let the past speak for itself. And here's a good example. When you hear somebody say the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, if you look at the secession documents, and if you Google them, they'll come up. And here's just one. And if I can read it to you here, it says, this is a Mississippi secession document. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Now you can argue that and I had relatives that fought for the Confederacy as well as I had relatives that fought for the Union. You could say, well, my relatives never owned slaves. Well, you can say that when we fought in Vietnam, which was supposedly a war to end the spread of communism, most soldiers that went over there to fight didn't know anything about communism either. But they were fighting either under orders or to protect the lifestyle. So rather than think about the attack on this as an attack on heritage or part of the culture wars, I would recommend you look at it as an opportunity to look at history in a new way, and that it opens new areas of celebration where we can celebrate the action of Americans, not just one part of Americans, but all Americans. I mean, if you think about and look at things like the Underground Railroad, that's a remarkable story of heroes. It's really a story of heroes. So that's kind of where I stand on this. And of course, I'm willing to hear other sides and debate it. But I know that perception makes a difference. And of course, I think myself that if we'd been better at our jobs, our country would not have been so divided. If we focused on the story of Americans, all Americans, and how great this country really is, that it doesn't belong just to one group, then I think that we'd be better off. I'm reminded that when St. Elizabeth Hospital was first started in Northern Kentucky in 1861, there was a movement by politicians to get them thrown out of Northern Kentucky. And to quote, and I'm sorry for using this language, but to keep those goddamn Catholics out of this place. And look at us now. I mean, do we regret that we allowed Catholics to come to our city? Obviously not. But at one time, we didn't want them. I mean, the cartoons, the political cartoons, the letters to the editor, the threats were horrific. But we don't think that now. So how do we get here? How do we keep our communities engaged? How do we deal with difficult subjects in a way that we can show both sides, as Jason says, and have a serious debate? The problem is, of course, we're looking at sound bites. We're not looking at the whole picture, and that's important, something that we do. And of course, I just throw this out. How does a museum remain relevant? So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think my students deal with it on a daily basis. I think Jason deals with it on a daily basis. I think Lori deals with it on a daily basis. I think the museum center deals with it on a daily basis. Running a museum is not easy, but sometimes it's a hell of a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. Challenging,
that kind of-
it's a lot of fun.
I think I'll end on that note and of course, open the floor for questions. I guess I'll stop my
well,
share. We go.
Right now, thank you very much, but I think we don't have any other questions unless anyone would like to add them in the chat. We had that one question. I think that was it. Jason, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good. I always enjoy our conversations, Brian, and I hope people have enjoyed this as much as I have, because it's interesting to think about kind of where museums came from, where we're going as museums, and how we not only accept the challenges before us, but also prevail in finding ways to give our audiences the tools to learn more about our heritage, and more about our history and what makes us us.
Do we also want to go ahead and answer the trivia question, though?
Oh yeah.
Did you want to give that answer, Dr. Hackett?
I think a lot of people saw it already. It's the Smithsonian.
Yes, and we had a winner. We had Carl Kocher was the winner. So congratulations to him. We also had some other few people that answered correctly. And also Lori Risch on Facebook. She answered correctly, but I think she already has a pin. So I don't know if she's disqualified for being the executive director or not. But let's see, we are just about out of time. If you don't have anything else to add, this has been a really interesting presentation. I just want to let everyone know that tomorrow night, we continue our Music at BCM concert series. So we've got Bam Powell and the Troublemakers coming to BCM. It's the drummer who drove the Goosehorn Band continues the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky sound tradition. And we also have a great exhibit on the politician and baseball player Jim Bunning that is now an exhibit, as well as an exhibit on Harlan Hubbard. So please come and check those out. Thanks to all the sponsors. Thank you, Dr. Hackett. Thank you, Jason, and all the supporters of BCM and all the staff and trustees. We do have a Facebook page with lots of curators chats that you can go and check out and learn more about the odd and crazy things that we get here at BCM in our collections. So please like and subscribe there. Let's see, there will not be a Northern Kentucky History Hour next week because we are continuing with our bi-weekly schedule this summer, but we'll be back on Wednesday, July 28th with Dave Schroeder. He's going to present Ludlow, How Transportation Transformed a City. So please make sure to tune in for that. So I think that's all for tonight. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and everyone take care and have a great night. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all. And thank you for great questions and a great conversation. I really appreciated that.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.